Welcome to Community Conversations, where we will be bringing you the latest insights on topics that everyone is talking about. My name is Cinder Sinclair, and I will be your host today, and we'll be discussing issues related to law enforcement. Our special guest today is retired Police Chief Barney Melekian. Welcome, Chief Melekian.
Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here, and please call me Barney. Chief is what I used to do.
Okay, that's a deal. Okay, so it seems to me that I remember reading that you have a long history in policing, in law enforcement. Over 50 years? Is that right?
It is. It's true.
Oh, I'd love for you to tell us about that.
Well, I have to see if I can remember back 50 years, but I actually went into law enforcement with every intention of doing it for a couple of years and then going to law school. That was my big plan. What I didn't plan on was falling in love with the profession and the opportunities that it's afforded me for all these years. I was with the Santa Monica Police Department for 23 years. That's where I started. It was the city I grew up in, and it was a great department, great people. I took a 1-year break in the mid 1970s. I was actually in Santa Barbara as a deputy sheriff for a year. Had a great time, made some great friends. The retired sheriff Jim Thomas was my training officer, or one of them. Yes. But for a variety of reasons, I decided to go back to Santa Monica, and where I finished my career in 1996. I never really thought about being a police chief, but the opportunity afforded itself, and Pasadena was where my grandparents had gone when they immigrated to this country back when, Armenia. Oh, God. And so I put in an application. I was really just doing it for the experience. When it got down to the final 8, I was the only one of the final 8 who wasn't either currently a police chief or hadn't been a police chief. But it worked out. I was hired as the police chief in 1996, and I had the privilege of serving there for 13 years, till 2009. And in the course of that time, I was the acting fire chief for 6 months and the acting city manager for 10 months.
Golly! While you were police chief.
Well, the fire chief was concurrent. The city manager thing, I actually took a leave from the department and to work in City Hall, and then they went back when they hired a permanent city manager. And in 2009, I was privileged to be selected by President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder to be the director of the Community Oriented Policing Services Office in Washington, D.C. Wow. So I lived in Washington for 4 years and did that work, traveled all over the country visiting police departments and sheriff's departments.
That was fascinating.
It was fascinating, and an incredible perspective on the state of American law enforcement. And then my wife Nancy and I decided that it was time to retire. So we came to Santa Barbara, and as you can see, I didn't do a really very good job of retiring. I had a consulting business for several years, but I was still traveling around the country, which I didn't care for very much. And Sheriff Bill Brown let me know that he was looking for a new undersheriff, and I decided that I would like to do that, and I was honored to be selected for that position. I did that for almost 4 years, and then I worked for the county CEO for about 3.5 years, overseeing public safety, which included cannabis licensing and registration, which was an interesting thing in itself.
Maybe not your favorite thing.
And well, actually, it turned out it was. It was so different from anything I've done, and I really learned a lot. And I think I made a little bit of a difference for some people.
That's good for you.
So it was good. And then I was getting ready to actually retire, and Paul Casey, the city manager of Santa Barbara, said, well, the police chief's retiring. Would you come and be the interim it'll only be for 6 months. Well, it turned out to be 18 months. And, so I did retire last July, and now with the exception of some occasional consulting business, that's my career. Although overlaid with that was 23 years in the Coast Guard Reserve, which is also actually a law enforcement agency as well, simultaneously with that. So
23 years Coast Guard. Boy, you were a busy guy.
I was, and I enjoyed everything that I ever did. So it was all good.
So you didn't always want to be police chief. You didn't even know that you wanted to have a career in law enforcement necessarily. Is that right?
That's true. I never had a plan to be a police chief. I never thought about it one way or another.
Yeah.
I loved what I did. I will say that looking back on 50 years, I will still say that my two favorite jobs, I was one of the first police dog handlers in the state of California. And I think we made a huge difference with that. But either being a dog handler or being a patrol sergeant were probably still my two favorite jobs.
Your two favorite jobs.
Yeah. But as my career advanced and I attended more schooling, it became apparent that law enforcement was changing. It actually changed several times over the course of that 50 years, which is actually, to me, one of the most interesting parts as I look back, is that somehow I was able to adapt to those changes. And there were several significant waves of change. And somewhere along the line, I realized that to make a difference, at least in one department, I really wanted to be the chief, and I thought I could do it. And for a variety of reasons, I thought maybe this was something I wanted to try. And as I mentioned, Pasadena was the first place I applied to, and it worked out.
So could you tell us a little bit about some of those changes? I mean, did they happen all at once, or did you sort of see them sneaking up? Or
no, they were, a couple of them were pretty dramatic. When I came in this business in 1973, we were very much into what was called the professional model of policing, which was very much arm's length. Really the focus of professional policing was to address corruption issues that stretched all the way back to the 20s and 30s. And so there was a very strong emphasis on keeping the community at arm's distance, on not having relationships with people. Your job was just to enforce the law. That was it. In some ways, it was a lot simpler than the things that came later. But in the mid-1980s, community policing came out of the genesis of it really was an article that appeared in Atlantic Monthly called Broken Windows, which today is somewhat controversial, but at the time was considered very groundbreaking. And it produced this idea that the police and the community needed to work together to decide what the policing priorities were. And that was a huge change for law enforcement because up until that point, policing told the community, well, this is how you're going to be policed. We're the experts and we know.
Sure.
And the idea that the community would say, well, wait a minute, that's not necessarily what's important to us, was new. And it was a transition. Yeah. It was a huge transition. The story I always like to tell, and I won't say the sergeant's name, but when I was a young police officer, there was a sergeant who used to end every roll call that he would say, now remember, at the time it was all male. That's another big change that took place. Sure. He'd say, now remember, boys, we're not going out there to sell ice cream. And about 10 years later, I was a sergeant, and brand new sergeant, and the same sergeant was still doing roll calls. And he was talking about, now I want you to go to this community meeting, and we've got a traffic problem in this neighborhood, and there's graffiti in this neighborhood, and I want you to, and he's giving all these instructions. And when the officers all left, I said, gosh, I remember when you used to tell us we weren't going out there to sell ice cream. And he said, son, now we're giving it away.
Oh.
And that, from his perspective, that was what had happened, because he had been in this business much longer than I have. And for him, that change was huge. But community policing really had evolved, in the cop's office. I could talk for hours just on that. But probably the next big wave of change was certainly the aftermath of 9/11 and the relationship between the federal government and local policing, and what was the role of local policing in the whole fighting terrorism prevention and those things. And it really, I think it changed the business in a lot of ways, and it created some challenges for us. And then, of course, lastly is the social justice movement, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, which has produced really a lot of demands about rethinking and reimagining and defunding the police. I think a lot of the rhetoric has been not helpful and irresponsible, but a lot of it pointed to the need for some things that very definitely needed to change. And I think right now we're in the middle of trying to make that, the profession's in the middle of trying to make that adjustment.
Interesting. And so if we bring that idea down to today in Santa Barbara, don't we have a sort of a newly forming, I think, Police and Fire Oversight Commission? Is that?
We do. Certainly one of the things, and it was happening long before 2020, was this recognition or really a demand on the part of the community and the public for some form of civilian oversight of law enforcement. And that was a very difficult thing to adjust to, I think, for some agencies. But for those of us, and I like to think that for the bulk of especially my executive career, I've tried to be on the front end of changes and reforms and things that were going on. And I think there's a recognition that oversight needed to happen. And certainly here, when I assumed the interim role, that process was just getting underway, so I was very intimately involved in it. And I think the issue is not whether there should be oversight. The issue is what should it look like. And my belief is that you cannot have a cookie cutter model that will fit every agency. It has to be tailored to the community and to the issues that you have. And I think the decision by the city council to take the existing Fire and Police Commission, which had existed for years, and which a lot of the authorities that the Community Formation Commission, the group of community members who were formed to make recommendations to the council, a lot of the things that they asked for, the Fire and Police Commission already had that authority. They had just never used it. And I think it's worth noting that at one point there were 27 or 28 very specific recommendations to the council, and the police department, i.e. me, supported, I think, 24 or 25 of them. So there was some debate about whether it should be the Fire and Police Commission or should it be this newly formed group. But I think the decision to put it in a body that already existed, but to raise the visibility of that body, to put it in the city council chambers, to televise their meetings, I think is going to make a huge difference.
As I listen to you, I find it fascinating that, seems like part of the human condition is we don't like change. No, here's how we do policing. What do you mean you're going to change it? But you notice the changes. You decided to get out in front of them, accept them, figure out what you can do to, facilitate that and have a positive outcome. That's what I'm hearing anyway.
I think, well, I appreciate that, and I'm no different than anybody else. I recognize sometimes what my default is, and sometimes the change is difficult. You said, well, nobody likes change. Very often, nobody likes change, and they also don't like how things are, and so they're trying to figure out, which one they're going to accommodate. But I think the reality is that law enforcement, public safety, policing, whatever term you want to use, has always been supposed to be for the betterment of the community. And if we're honest with ourselves, and it's difficult sometimes, but if we're honest with ourselves, the history of law enforcement in America, up until the last 40 or 50 years, has really been about enforcing the status quo. Whatever the political status quo was, we have a very decentralized law enforcement system in this country. There's over 18,000 police and sheriff's departments, most of whom have fewer than 50 officers. So policing is very, very local. And that has strengths, and that also presents some challenges. And one of the challenges is there's a tendency to reinforce the bias of whatever that community is. Whatever the community is that hired that police department. the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a recognition that some of that doesn't work, and that a lot of that enforcing the status quo included over-policing of marginalized communities. And certainly the racial issue is very real and very alive, and anybody that says it's not is kidding themselves. And I think law enforcement has made monumental strides in trying to change its approach and change how it does business.
So when you look back over your career, what are some of the things you enjoyed most about being police chief?
Well, I think one of the things, probably the most thing, was the opportunity, the recognition that as the police chief, you really can make a huge difference if you're in the community that you serve. If you're inclined that way, you have an opportunity. You have resources at your disposal, and one of the things that was challenging about being the city manager was everything was about consensus, and about you didn't take action until you built some consensus. Law enforcement, the fire department, public safety in generally speaking, is if you want to make something happen, if you want to do something, the resources are there to do it, and you can make that difference. And the recognition, I loved going to community meetings. They weren't always pleasant, especially if it was in the aftermath of a tough incident. But I think I learned that lesson. There was an officer-involved shooting, and it was very controversial, but it was controversial for a very different set of reasons. It was not about the facts of what occurred. It was about how people felt about the police department in general. That was not here in Santa Barbara.
Okay.
And for 3.5 hours, I really took a lot of abuse and listened to a lot of people talk about what bothered them. But at the end of the day, I was told later that was the day, even though I had been the chief for 7 or 8 years at that point, that was the day that I became the chief, because I didn't get up and walk out. I didn't tell them that they were wrong. And people weren't talking about the police department. They weren't even talking about the shooting. They were talking about the community that they lived in and how they felt marginalized and cut out. And the recognition that I was in a position to maybe help do something about that really was very powerful. That to me was the best part about being a chief. The second best part is that I've noticed that when you're the chief and you call somebody, they take your calls. When you're not the chief, they'll get back to you.
Oh gosh. So back to the story where you're sitting there for so long and everybody's carrying on and saying all these things to you that are so negative. The fact that you listened, they felt heard, and you didn't get all bent out of shape. That is really an admirable quality, and I can see why they would have changed at that point.
I won't pretend that it was easy.
No, I'm sure not.
I still look back on it because I've always prided myself on my ability to communicate. And that day there wasn't any. My only function was to be there and listen. But the stories that people had and the pain that they had and the things that they were talking about, you realize you're playing on a stage that's much bigger than just the facts of what made this meeting happen in the first place.
Well, good for you for realizing that, for listening, for responding appropriately. That's great. I love that story.
Yeah.
So when you look at law enforcement today, whether locally or in the country or the state or whatever, what are some of the common challenges that law enforcement is facing?
Well, there's a lot of commonality across the entire country, and we're experiencing it locally. And the biggest one is staffing.
Staffing, okay.
Recruitment and retention. The number of people who show up at recruiting fairs or at the department, I don't know what the police department's doing these days. I think they test every 2 or 3 months. The sheriff's office tests generally pretty frequently, but there's not a lot of big turnout for this.
Oh.
And when I, admittedly, this is 50 years in the past, but when I showed up at El Camino College in Torrance to take what was called the South Bay Regional Exam, there were 1,200 people there. Today, at any one of these tests, you're lucky to get, 20 or 30.
Wow.
And it's a challenge, and it's part of it, a big part of it. It had been going on before. There had been a decline. I've thought for a long time that law enforcement has not done a great job of telling the story of what we do every day. And I think between TV and people's common misperceptions, there's this sense that the day-to-day life of a police officer is all this cops and robbers stuff. And there's a little bit of that, but it's not every day. The bigger part of the day is generally spent in service and in contacting people and talking to people and just, handling problems, big and small. Most 99.9% of which will never make the papers. Nobody will ever hear about it, and you move on. But the underlying foundational piece always was that the community and the political power structure supported local law enforcement. And so even if there were incidents that were bad that needed to be addressed, or even if there were people who were never going to be satisfied with anything the police did, there was a general sense that the community at large supported law enforcement. And while I believe that's still true, the rhetoric and the noise in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd really, I think, made a lot of officers question their choice of career, and made them go, well, wait a minute, is this what I want to do? Is this what I want to be part of? I've talked to, and it's sad, I still do some consulting work. So I talk with people who are still active in the business. And, some of them have been very distraught because they've been in this business 20 or 30 years, and their children aren't proud of them.
Oh, gosh.
And it's very hard for somebody, for the negative incidents that make the news. I think what gets lost in there is that no police officer anywhere in this country gets in a car at the beginning of their shift and says, I really hope I can ruin someone's life today. I really hope I can cost my city millions of dollars today. I really hope I can hurt somebody today. They don't.
Yeah.
They don't. But if you listen to some of the rhetoric that came out, you would think that people do believe that. And it's very hard then for young people. I admire the people who come into our business today, because the 60s were an interesting time to come into law enforcement as well. There was a lot of social pressure to not do that. But I think it's more extreme today. Yeah. And it's a challenge. I think so. Everything, staff recruitment and retaining the people that you have, and then really deciding, okay, what is it that we want the police to do? One of my heroes in this business is Chief Ed Flynn, and Chief Flynn was in Arlington, Virginia on 9/11 when the planes hit the Pentagon. He was the police chief in Milwaukee for a long time, but he summed it up brilliantly. He said, at the end of the day, police officers are the armed agents of the state, which is true. And he said, the question as a society we have to ask is, when do we want those officers in our living room? What is it that we want them to do? And post-2020, there has not been a clearly defined sort of social discussion about what we want law enforcement to do. So, for example, well, we don't want to send the police on calls for mentally ill, but you don't address the issue of the people that you are going to send maybe need some security. You don't address, and
Gotcha.
nobody argues with that. But anyway, I could go on for a long time about this. But these challenges about what is the role of policing, it needs to be answered in every community, but it needs to be answered clearly.
Yeah. And I suppose that question will go on, and the changes will happen and happen and happen. But I'm thinking that maybe, let's just say, someone in Santa Barbara, they read about something happening somewhere else, Chicago, LA, whatever, and then they become sort of afraid that that's going to happen in Santa Barbara, or maybe they're wondering, gosh, has it happened and I didn't even notice? So do you think that everyone is painted with the same brush sometimes inadvertently?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I mean, I think that's what's been so challenging about defining what local oversight should look like. I think it's very important to look at what is the state, and when I say look at, I mean, I'm talking about society, I'm talking about elected officials, the community at large. What has been our experience with our police department here? Good and bad. Let's be honest about that and assess that. Let's not talk about what we read happened in South Carolina or what we read happened in Kansas.
Right.
Yes, you don't want that to happen, but neither does anybody else.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that bad incidents never happen, but the question is, what is happening here in our place? That I think, when I talked earlier about defining what it is we want the police to be, I think every community really owes it to itself to put a lot of effort and resource into a lot of community relationship building.
And that's really what you mean when you say, remember, policing is local.
Yes. Because you have to, I mean, that's the strength of it. I mean, it's no coincidence. I think it's a very interesting data point is that in Los Angeles County, there are 88 cities. 44 of them contract with the LA sheriffs for law enforcement. 72 of them contract with LA County Fire for fire services. Because from an economic perspective, contracting is very efficient, it's cost effective, it's all those things. But people recognize that they want local control over law enforcement. And that's, if we're going to do that, then that decision, that analysis has to be local as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a minute about our homeless situation here in Santa Barbara, which is probably no different than other communities. But, when you live in the middle of what we consider a problem or a challenge, then we're more aware of it. So let's talk about the homeless situation in Santa Barbara and the role that you see of police in that regard.
I think the situation with homeless folks across the country, and locally, is probably one of the most frustrating and difficult to solve. It is not, and it should not be, a law enforcement problem. It really isn't. The challenge is that the issue is really about the lack of mental health resources and the lack of substance abuse treatment beds. And the third thing I would add is that while there are a lot of services available, in Santa Barbara especially, we have a number of nonprofits that are doing a lot of good work. There is no way to compel people to take those services. And so you have this sort of vicious cycle where you have people who may be suffering with mental health challenges, or maybe suffering with substance abuse challenges, or both. And so who may not be completely capable of making a decision that's in their own best interest. But if they say that they don't want services, you can't, for the most part, you can't compel them to do that. Until we fix that, we're gonna stay on this merry-go-round. Law enforcement ends up in the position, usually, there's some antisocial behavior. Somebody's lounging in my doorway. Somebody's in Santa Monica. The worst part was because people didn't always lock their cars, and people, when the homeless situation first started arising, people would get up to go to work in the morning and find somebody sleeping in the back seat of their car. Law enforcement can come out and address that. They can chase the person away. They can arrest them if it's appropriate, but they're not solving the problem, and they're not going to solve the problem. The problem is going to be solved when there are a sufficient number of shelter beds, sufficient number of treatment beds, and the ability to make people have to take those services.
Yeah. So that's what you mean when you say compel them.
Yes.
Just, okay, here's the service that we think is best for you, and you have to stay until someone decides otherwise.
And I don't want to put it quite that way, because I think that somebody has to sit down. There has to be a criteria for this, and I don't pretend to know whether there's a cause and effect here, but I do remember when you talk about going back 50 years. I do remember when the state mental health hospitals closed. I also remember that they were supposed to be replaced by neighborhood clinics, and in Santa Monica there was such a neighborhood clinic. And so when we found people suffering from what appeared to be a mental health crisis or possibly substance abuse, we took them to the clinic. We didn't take them to jail. We took them to the clinic. And their doctors and trained people would make decisions about what's the best next step. Do they just need to sit here for a few hours and kind of get calmed down? Do they need medication? Do they need to go to the hospital? One way or another, that decision was made there. And then one day, and again, I was a very young cop. I didn't know any of the social sort of political things that were going on. But one day it wasn't there anymore. And so when it wasn't there anymore, then we took people to jail. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was right about that same time that in Santa Monica and other places, but Santa Monica was ground zero for the homeless in LA County for a long time.
Is that right? I don't think I knew that.
And all of a sudden there were homeless people in the parks, all of them, and on the beach and everywhere. And I'm not convinced that there isn't a cause and effect there.
When you think about the numbers, it seems anyway, the numbers of homeless increasing, I just wonder if part of that is a factor of the nature of substance abuse, the nature of mental illness, and sort of the track that is typically on. And so therefore, more people are on that track, more people are homeless, and there's no solution.
And in all honesty, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know if there are more, or if they're just more visible. Well,
that's a good point.
People have been trying to sort of study that for forever.
Right. There's no easy answers.
There isn't.
Nobody's come up with an answer yet. In fact, didn't I hear you say, let's see if I can remember, you were in Pasadena and people said, let's go to Santa Barbara, because I hear that they...
I was in Santa Monica.
So you were in Santa Monica. People said, let's go to Santa Barbara, because we hear that they have the great approach to the homeless
They're on the
situation.
cutting edge of how to deal with the homeless.
And then the rest of the story. Tell us the rest of the story.
And we came up here. I was a young lieutenant. I was on Santa Monica's homeless task force, and we visited Santa Barbara and looked at their programs and looked at their approach that the city as a whole was taking, not just the police department. And then fast forward about 30 years, when I moved here, I was on the Fire and Police Commission for about a year before I started working at the sheriff's office. And I discovered that Santa Barbara PD was sending people to Santa Monica to study how to deal with the homeless because they were on the cutting edge of how to deal with it. Nobody's really been on the cutting edge of this.
Yeah.
That's a whole show in itself, about the whole intersection of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. I will say that in 2000, from 2000 to 2002, I was on a national commission on mental health and criminal justice. And I pulled a book out a year or so ago and looked at the recommendations that our task force had made. And a lot of them are just as relevant today.
Is that right?
as they were 20 years ago, and which tells me how little progress we've actually made.
We've not made so much progress because nobody seems to have the answers, or there aren't enough resources, or do you have a guess about that?
Oh, this is where I start skating on, sort of thin ice on these interviews, because I think the resources that have been committed are immense. I mean, billions of dollars have been, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, in one form or another, have been put in to try to deal with the issue of homelessness. And especially in the big cities, every newly elected mayor, one of the platform pieces that they come into office with is, we're going to do something about the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is, until you make a decision about what something is,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times it's just a matter of pushing them from one place to another,
Mm-hmm.
or pushing them to saying, well, we don't want, we're not going to, we don't want you to be here because it's too visible, so you can go be over here.
Yeah.
We're going to spend a lot of energy talking people into accepting services. And I would argue that the section in the law that defines a danger to yourself and others
Mm-hmm.
has been so narrowly written that neither public safety nor mental health professionals or anybody else can do very much.
Mm.
And I had as a consequence of that same commission I talked about, the privilege of testifying in front of Congress in 2001.
Mm.
And I said, at the time, you don't hear it so much anymore, but at the time, part of the narrative was, well, people have a right to be homeless. They have a right to be homeless.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And my statement to them was, what you're really saying is they have a right to die on the street, because that's what was happening. Mm. And even in my tenure here, particularly the 18 months as police chief, I think at least 3 times I went to a situation where a homeless person had died on the street, mm-hmm. had died in a doorway or died in a parking lot where they were sleeping. And to me, that's just abominable.
Yeah.
Just abominable.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just say you had a magic wand and you had all the resources that you needed. What changes or improvements, let's just say improvements, would you make in policing, law enforcement, or you could narrow it down to policing in Santa Barbara, whatever comes to your mind? What would you?
I think one of the things I would do is look and see one of the things that's happened in law enforcement across the country, especially with the advent of the 911 system, mm-hmm. is that we have trained people that any time that you call 911, one or more highly trained professional people are going to come to your location and try to solve your problem. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that's really what we want to be doing. Mm. The things that people call the police for today that they would have never called the police for 30 or 40 years ago, mm-hmm. really quite incredible. And when you look at the things that we do, or they do, I'm past tense now, in terms of dealing with child custody disputes, in terms of neighborhood disputes over things that are so minor. You're going, why are you calling the armed agents of the state to your house for this? I would put in place some kind of neighborhood resolution issues.
Okay.
I would certainly put more resources into public mental health, mm-hmm. so that there were more mental health professionals mm-hmm. available to respond 24/7 to deal with certain issues. Mm-hmm. And I would find a way to give law enforcement officers a sabbatical every 5 years or so, to go and do something else, work with a nonprofit, take some time off, do something, mm-hmm. but just to remind yourself that the work that you do matters and it counts, but that there's this bigger world out there, and sometimes you just need to take a break from it. People, I think for the most part, really have no idea of the myriad of decisions, big and small, mm-hmm. that the average police officer makes every day.
I'll bet you're right. I like that idea of a sabbatical. So, Barney, I've heard you talk before about the importance of officer wellness. Can you elaborate a little bit and tell me what you mean by that?
You know, yes, I mean, one of the great dirty secrets of the business is the suicide rate
Really?
in law enforcement, and it's hugely significant. It's a national problem. It's really only started to be acknowledged in the last decade or so. It has not been a subject of discussion, and I think part of it is that the mentality of law enforcement is that you're supposed to be a problem solver. You're supposed to fix everybody else's things. You're supposed to be in control. And when things happen to you, or appear to start wearing on you, you don't. There's often a reluctance to acknowledge it and to reach out and get some help. I think it was the author Joseph Wamba said that the greatest danger to a police officer is not a criminal's bullet or a speeding car. He said it was the daily drop of corrosion on the human soul, and
the daily drop of corrosion on the human soul. Wow.
And it's true. I mean, you go into this business with the idea that you're going to help people. And one of the things you discover very often is that you're confronted with circumstances that you really have no control over. You can clean it up, you can sort it out a little bit, you can push people off in different directions, but you're not fixing it. And that burden gets to be very heavy after a while. And I will tell you that in all the years of my business, the single greatest tragedy for me personally was the suicide of one of my officers.
Oh, really?
And he was not a problem officer in the sense that he was a star performer, everything laid out. Nobody saw this coming, but it happened. And so this idea of making sure that the appropriate, you asked me about what resources, what would I make available? And I really should have mentioned that I would make sure that there was adequate counseling resources in a variety of forms, so that people and a continual sort of barrage of reminders that if you're going through difficult times, if you're facing personal challenges, if you feel like it's too much, get help. And that to me is a huge issue.
And didn't I hear you say something like, for every officer that's killed on duty, there are X number that take their own life?
I think the nationally accepted number is 7. That for every officer killed in the line of duty, 7 officers will kill themselves.
Gosh, I bet most people don't know that.
I don't think they do.
So officer wellness and safety would include some kind of counseling on a regular basis and encouragement to do that. So what about the fear of prosecution that some officers may have that would make them reluctant to take the next step to do their job?
Yeah, that's a touchy one. One of the aspects of this job, and one of the reasons that there's so much emphasis on training, is that law enforcement officers are very often put in positions of making split-second decisions. The amazing thing is that 99% of the time they make the right decision. Sometimes they don't, in which case there need to be consequences for that. The national narrative, though, about that if they do something wrong, they should be prosecuted, and the fact that there are prosecutors in this country who seem to be very willing to do that. People go, wait a minute. Doctors don't get held to that standard. All kinds of people who are in the difficult decision business recognize that you deal with the case at hand where somebody where it didn't come out the way it was supposed to come out. You deal with that. I'm not talking about ignoring it, but you don't do these blanket changes that affect everybody who's not not part of that. And the biggest example is this idea that, well, we need to get rid of qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is a legal concept that says that if you go to do, as a law enforcement officer, you go to do your job and you follow the law and you follow departmental policy, that you're not going to be criminally prosecuted for a decision. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean there may not be other consequences, but you're not going to be criminally prosecuted. And the people that talk about taking that away, that protection away, of following the law and following policy, really don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea about what they're talking about setting in motion. But what I do know is that the recruitment and retention problem is just going to get worse.
Yeah. I can see that they would be afraid of that. Now, I've heard you talk about how the idea of reverence for life and how Santa Barbara does such a good job with that. Maybe just touch on that a bit.
The President Obama in 2014, in the aftermath of Ferguson, put together this commission. It was the Commission on 21st Century Policing. And they had a series of recommendations. And one of them, I think the first one, was that the departments needed to train and emphasize a reverence for human life, by which they meant that when you were dealing with tactical situations, when you were confronting things, that it was important to remember that the concepts of de-escalation, of trading time and space, so that you didn't have to make a lethal force decision, that should become part of the culture, if you will. One of the things that struck me about Santa Barbara, both in the sheriff's office and particularly in the police department, was that reverence for life concept is well baked in. And it occurred long before I got there, so I'm not taking any credit for it. But I have watched, in my 18 months with the police department, I counted up at least 10, and probably more, but at least 10 situations where lethal force would have been legally and morally justified. And my definition of morally, I was challenged on using that word once, of morally justified is that you can live with yourself, that you know that you did everything you could before you took that action. But I've watched Santa Barbara officers take hours to resolve a situation so that they didn't have to use lethal force. It really is quite impressive to watch.
Wow.
And people probably don't know that either, because the police didn't kill somebody doesn't make a headline.
Yeah. Gosh, isn't that the truth? Well, sounds like we can be really proud of our police department, sheriff department, fire department. Thank you for that. Let's say that somebody's watching this and they're thinking, well, I know there's a lot of challenges, but I think I might want to look into becoming a police officer or going into law enforcement in one form or another. What is the preparation and what is the route that, I mean, yours was circuitous, of course, and probably many people's are, but what's the typical training or time frame for someone that wants to go into this?
Whatever point in life you decided you wanted to do that, and I'm aware of a couple of people that I know about personally that were in their 50s when they went to the police academy.
Oh.
Now, there's no exaggeration to say that the police academy is physically demanding, and you need to be in shape for that.
Physical shape.
Physical shape for that. You also have to, I think, know why you want to do it. Are you committed to a life of? Do you want to have a life of service? Are you prepared to deal with the fact that not everybody's going to love you? But the process, to answer your question, is that regardless of when you come in, there's a pretty lengthy application process and a background check.
Okay.
And that generally takes 6 to 12 months, depending on what's going on. There's a written exam. There's usually an oral interview. There's a psychological assessment. There's a medical assessment, and there's your background. And when you've completed all that, then you go to the academy.
Okay, then you go to the academy. Then they let you in.
Then they let you in, and you're in the academy. And you're actually still not a police officer or a deputy sheriff then. You're a trainee.
Oh, okay.
You want an example of how the business has changed in 50 years? When I came in this business, you did not have to have gone to the academy to work on the street.
Ah.
You had to go to the academy within the first year of being on the street. But I worked on the street for 6 weeks with no academy training at all, which, if you think about it, is pretty frightening.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you go to the academy, which is generally 6 months, give or take, depending on where you are. And then you will come out, and you will then spend, realistically, the next 4 to 6 months at a minimum in the presence of a field training officer. And everything that you do is documented. And so there's really the training process. Between the application process and the training process, you're at least 2 years away from where you're, quote unquote, good to go in terms of being ready to work the street. And I have argued publicly and privately that, and it won't happen in my lifetime, but that our training academies really need to be more in the European model, which is generally the academies are 12 to 18 months. And the way they work is you spend 3 months in the academy, basically in school, and then you spend 3 months in the field. And then you come back and spend 3 months in the academy, and then you spend 3 months in the field. And so there's this merger of theoretical and practical that I think would have a lot of benefit, but it would obviously be a radical sea change for.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And like you said, they have to constantly be in good physical condition.
You have to be in good physical condition. And the other thing is there's especially in California, but across the country, with the continual changing of updating of laws and new requirements and new restrictions.
Right.
There's a continual education process that is always ongoing.
Gosh. Okay. So, Barney, what would you say to the average citizen out there about Santa Barbara? Let's just look at Santa Barbara Police Department, Sheriff Department, Fire Department even. Let's say they were just interested in, I don't know, figuring out how to support that better, or how to be a better citizen, or what they can do as a good citizen. What would you have to say?
Almost every police department, and the Santa Barbara Police Department in particular, is very good at this. They have the Volunteers in Policing program. There are a myriad of ways to volunteer to be around the police department. The sheriff's office has the same. I've just been away from them for a few years, so I don't know what their specifics are. But if you go to the website of any law enforcement agency where you live or it's around you, you can find volunteer opportunities. Many departments have what is called the Citizens Police Academy, which is a great way to get to know your local department and the people who work there. And there are also a number of jobs in and around law enforcement, paid jobs, that have nothing to do with enforcement, but that are equally in demand. And I will say, just for the benefit of whoever's watching this, that I think when we talk about law enforcement, we very often talk almost exclusively about the officers on the street, the sworn officers. But I will tell you, the most underappreciated, unacknowledged group is emergency communications operators, who probably for every phone call that comes into a police department communication center that results in a police car being sent somewhere, they will answer the phone 5 to 7 times. They are in so many ways the voice or the face, and the decisions that they have to make and the things that they have to do. Yeah. That's just one example of many jobs that are available if people are interested.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for being on our Community Conversations.
Oh, my pleasure.
And for all of your wonderful work on behalf of so many people. We appreciate you a lot.
Thank you, Senator.
And thank you for joining us on Community Conversations, and we'll see you next time.